let me give two things. No, number one, which is a logical fallacy that a lot of people fall for. The last 20 years, this has been the average growth rate. So it's going to be the same growth rate for the next 20 years. What they forget is the last 20, especially the last 40 years, has been a one-off event. Moving from the countryside to the city, industrializing. You only do that once. And they concentrated it into a single generation. The kicker is, by compressing it, yes, you do get higher growth rate during that period, but you never get any of the ancillary stuff and the education and the sophistication and the technology that goes with it. So we've done this over 10 generations. And if you look at the growth of the last 10 generations, we've expanded our economy by roughly a factor of 350. The Chinese have done it in 40 years, yes, and that's impressive, and the annual growth rates are certainly higher, but their collective growth is less than half of ours. And now they're left with a demographic that's inverted. So the fallacy doesn't take into account the fact that you can only do this once, and they've shot everything they've got in order to get to this point. Second problem, without globalization, nothing in China works. They import all the raw materials, they export all the finished goods. That doesn't work without the US Navy making it safe for them. So if we ever do have a real breach in the relationship, China's done the next day. And they have famine within a year. And another reason. Oh yeah, Americans aren't happy unless we're really stressed out about something. The greatest Red Scare we had was in 1985, when this guy named Gorbachev took over. And even though Gorbachev came in with the intent of ending the Cold War peacefully, we were convinced that the end was very nigh. This is just who we are. It's part of the reason why I'm a little worried that we're not going to realize China's gone until it's too late. And I will never, ever, ever tell our military to not prepare for a fight. And China is the obvious candidate for the other side. I would just like to see us spend 1% of the effort that we spend preparing for a fight to prepare for what happens the day after China ends. Because we failed to do that for the Soviet period. And we are still cleaning up that mess. Iran, North Korea, China, 9/11, these are all things that are indelibly linked to the Soviet collapse. So, chin up, we'll be okay, but maybe plan for tomorrow instead of for a fight. Putting up us and the Mexicans for comparison, this is the Chinese demographic. It is, according to these data, one of the 5 fastest aging societies in human history. And we now know this is wrong, because about 3 months ago, the Chinese updated their data. And since 2017, they're now admitting to a 70% drop in their birth rate. That is faster than the decline in the birth rate suffered by the Jews during the Holocaust. Unprecedented in human history, even if you include wartime. And the Shanghai Academy of Sciences, which is like their think tank that is supposed to interpret all the data, says that even this is now wrong. The Shanghai Academy estimates that they've overcounted their population by more than 100 million people, with all of the missing millions being people who would have been born since the one-child policy was adopted 40 years ago, which is a sanitized way of saying that all of their missing millions are under age 40, suggesting that these yellow bars don't even exist. Assuming nothing else goes wrong, China has at most 10 years left as a unified, industrialized nation state. They're done. The question is whether they last 10 years or significantly less. My bet's less. They're not competitive anymore. This is average worker cost per month for a number of Southeast Asian countries that I'm pretty bullish on. Here are our Mexican neighbors right in the middle, hyper-competitive, and there's the Chinese. They've had a 14-fold increase in labor costs in the last 22 years, but labor productivity hasn't even tripled. In some sectors, it's quadrupled, but they haven't caught up with how much it costs. And now that there's not even a new generation coming up, it's only going to get worse from here. Pretty much anyone who has reshored or friend-shored manufacturing has discovered that they have a simpler supply chain with a lower cost structure than what they had when they were in China. This is vehicle sales in the Chinese space. When a country industrializes and urbanizes in the modern age, everybody's after the same four things in the same order: smartphone, refrigerator, air conditioning unit, car sales. The dotted red line is the 12-month moving average. The blue bar is the beginning of COVID. You'll notice that the dotted red line not only has not recovered to pre-COVID levels, but it peaked a year and a half before COVID. One of the crazy things we're learning is that in the last 5 years, we've all been a little distracted. China went down the path of cult of personality. COVID muddled everybody's data and skewed everyone's perspective. And the Trump administration, well, I mean, that was like living inside of a bullhorn. We all missed a lot of the details of the world, especially in a place like China where information doesn't exactly flow freely. And so think of some of those big thresholds that you've heard about, China hitting in the last 2 years. Population starts to fall. India passes them. The United States average citizen is now younger than the average Chinese citizen. All those things have happened in the last few years. We're now discovering that what didn't happen in the last 3 years. Most of those happened a decade ago. It's not that China's at its peak or is about to hit its peak. Its peak was in the early 2010s, maybe even the late 2000s. And we're only now starting to get a good look at the place. This is something that a really, really, really competent, even-handed government might be able to slow. I don't think they could reverse it, but they could slow it. That is not what we're seeing in China. Chairman Xi has created the tightest cult of personality in human history, more than Mao, more than Caligula. He has executed or imprisoned or exiled or intimidated to silence everyone within the country who is capable of conscious thought, to the degree that not only will people not speak truth to power, so many messengers have been shot that no one will speak to power at all. He is now the most isolated world leader ever. Quick war story. Ukraine. You guys remember back in March of last year when Vladimir Putin was the one personally making the nuclear threats against the United States? The way it was explained to me when I was in Washington was that the Biden administration dispatched the ambassador with a simple message. And so the ambassador gets Putin alone in a room. He's like, Mr. Putin, I'm not going to tell you anything you don't know here. But if I shine a light on the facts from a slightly different angle, I'm hoping that it will get you to modify your behavior. So do you remember, Mr. Putin, back in January, when you were having all of your meetings in that safe room under the Kremlin? The room where you have to go into a safe, into a safe, into a safe so that there's no electronic monitoring. And no notes were taken, there were no minutes. And you decided the specific day that you were going to pull the trigger for the war. You remember how when you left that safe that we had already published the minutes of that meeting in the international media? That was our subtle way as Americans of telling you that we know exactly where you are at any given moment. So if you think you can fling a few nukes into the Western Hemisphere, and the first half dozen we send back are going to go anywhere except directly up your ass, you're out of your mind. So stop it. And since then, Putin hasn't breathed a single nuclear threat. You see, Putin, for all his flaws, has an inner circle. He has people he speaks to. Information can theoretically at least make it to him. There are discussions, which means there are phones to tap, and emails to hack, and faxes to steal. There's a purchase for our intelligence system to capture information about the inner workings of the Kremlin. That doesn't exist for the Chinese, not because we can't hack into it. Actually, their information security is nothing compared to the Russians. But Xi speaks with no one. There is no inner circle. There are no conversations. And so we get a government in a box. The second most powerful economy on the planet is managed by one person who has insisted he's the only decision maker, but he's created a network where information cannot flow to him. And so that leaves the Chinese bureaucracy in a bit of a pickle because they're trying to interpret their boss's wishes and they have to do it third hand. And so we get data just vanishing because they think for whatever reason it looks bad. So COVID deaths, they just stopped collecting the data. Consumer confidence data. I don't know how you claim to have a consumption-led economy if you don't have consumer confidence data. Bond transactions. Data is not even collected anymore. How do you have a bond market? But the ones that worry me the more, college dissertations, and political biographies of local officials. What Xi and the bureaucracy have done is made sure that there is no one under the age of 50 who can develop a reputation for competence and then rise up through the system. It's just Xi. This, to me, looks like the early stages of state collapse. 10 years? That's assuming that it's demographics that kills them. Sheer incompetence, especially if you're familiar with Chinese history, has killed a lot more governments in Beijing.